Welcome to Shul.com. We are here at the Certified Kolel Bobker, and we are learning from Joe Bobker. He had an article called "To Flee or to Stay." We are here in part 4, discussing what happened before the Holocaust. What were the signs? Why did the leaders and the rabbis warn or not warn the populace to leave? What really happened? He did a tremendous research, and we are on page 10. Let's continue. During the winter of 1921, 50 students, including Rabbi Aharon Kotler from Yeshivat Etz Chaim, a branch of Slobodka and Slutsk, White Russia, fled to Kletsk, Poland. The Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Isser Zalman Meltzer, stayed behind with the remaining 100 students. Among them was Rabbi Elazar Menachem Man Shach, the Vabolinsker Matmid, and future Rosh Yeshiva of Panovich in Bnei Brak. Rav Meltzer, based on a Gemara, Torah is a shield against suffering, which is, it's brought down Torah Magne Umatzle. He has here in 22 a note. Let's take a look. That's brought down in Masechet Sotah 21a. Was convinced that the presence of a yeshiva and its Torah learning protected the local 15,000 Jews of Slutsk. But the harsh reality of a merciless Bolshevism soon prevailed. The yeshiva was confiscated, the teaching of Torah outlawed. In a letter dated December 1922 and addressed to his relative, let's take a look what he has here. Rav Meltzer's father-in-law, Rabbi Shraga Feivel Frank, a wealthy fur merchant in Kovno, Lithuania, and Rav Frank's father, Rabbi Yehuda Leib, were brothers. Rabbi Tzvi Pesach Frank, the future chief rabbi of Jerusalem, Rav Meltzer poured out his spiritual quandary. I am confused. It seems advisable and correct to depart from here. And then it seems that there is no permission to leave here according to Torah law. And he mentions here Rabbi Asher Bergman, Path to Greatness, the life of Maran Harav Elazar Menachem Man Shach in volume 1. And Rav Kotler recalls the hesitancy of his father-in-law, Rav Meltzer, in leaving. He definitely did not want to leave, even though it was already impossible to function, due to his great compassion for the townspeople who found solace in him amidst their bleak plight. He endangered himself and remained, despite having various opportunities to leave the city. Only after he had spent 6 weeks in jail, together with Rav Sandomierski, and been released on bail with 2 court cases pending against him for teaching Torah, and was in an extremely dangerous situation, did he ask me to ask the Hafetz Chaim whether he should leave Slutsk. And he mentions here the letter from Yedael Meltzer, Rav Salman's grandson, is Hamodia, December 16th, 1981. Rabbi Yisrael Meir Kagan advised Rav Meltzer not to leave. The Rosh Yeshiva stayed another 18 months until the circumstances became intolerable. When the communist decrees worsened and they persecuted the Torah scholars more and more, I had to leave that evil place. In 1925, Rav Meltzer boarded a boat to Palestine. Rav Meltzer's place was taken by Rabbi Yehezkel Hatzkel Abransky, a brilliant 37-year-old Torah scholar who survived the Holocaust by leaving Europe early in 1932 for England. We had become one of the most prominent dayanim of the post-war era, heading the London Beit Din for 17 years. Now, after Rav Meltzer boarded a boat to Palestine, a decision that saved his immediate family from the Holocaust. The Jewish community of Slutsk would later be ravaged by the Nazis and their collaborators. It ceased to exist by the end of 1941. The same bloody fate awaited the Jewish community of Kletsk, including the murder of the yeshiva's Mashgiach, Rabbi Yaakov Cherbatsky, his wife Dvorah, who was Rav Kotler's sister, and their son. When Rabbi Moshe Feinstein returned to Luban, and he has here a few notes, let's take a look. Rabbi Shimon Finkelman and Rabbi Nosson Sherman, Rabbi Moshe, The Life and Ideals of Hagaon, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, 1986. And he has here note 28. It says here, because Rabbi Moshe had fled Luban on a Lag BaOmer, he never kept this day as a pause in Sefirah mourning. Interesting. So when Rav Moshe Feinstein returned to Luban, right Russia, Belarus, he faced a new threat: the zealous members of Yevsekskia, the Jewish section of the Soviet Communist Party, who sought the death of Judaism as a religion. So here, this is like almost like the Erev Rav. That was a different group of people that were Jewish, that were challenging the status quo of Orthodox Judaism and Haredim. Let's take a look here on the bottom. It says here, there must have been something special about Belarus. Not only did it produce Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, the leading 20th century American posek, but also 3 presidents and 4 prime ministers of Israel, including Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Shamir, Golda Meir, and Ariel Sharon. That's very interesting, actually, that they all came from Belarus. Karl Marx, the baptized Jew and prophet of communism, fiercely attacked his former religion. By the 1930s, there was a plethora of anti-Semitic laws. The teaching of Torah was declared a crime. Yeshivot and Chaderim became illegal. Synagogues were requisitioned and used as socialist meeting clubs, and Joseph Stalin found a new hobby: persecuting rabbis. Rabbis had to pay punitive taxes, and false accusations were followed by sham trials. How did the Rabbanim react? Many simply quit their posts, as brought down by Salo W. Baron and the Russian Jews under Tsars and Soviets in 1976. Meanwhile, Rabbi Shalom Dov Ber Schneerson, the 5th rabbi of Lubavitch, who's the Rashab, stayed and organized a clandestine network of Jewish educational facilities. The network of Jewish educational institutions that his son, Rav Yosef Yitzchak, the 6th Rebbe of Lubavitch, established during the early Soviet regime, was a significant factor in the preservation of Judaism amongst Soviet Jews. Rav Schneerson's escape from the Russians in 1927 was aided by Rabbi Mordechai Dubin, head of Agudat Yisrael in Latvia and a senator in the Latvian parliament. Rav Dubin survived the Holocaust and remained in Russia, only to be killed by the communists in 1957. So it's interesting that the head of the Agudat Yisrael helped the 6th Lubavitch Rebbe to get out. Very interesting.
Why?
Because he knew that he was in trouble and what was happening, so he went out of his way to help another Jew. The reason I say that is because there are 2 different schools of thought. The Chabad Hasidut is one school of thought, and Litvish is a completely different school of thought in learning, education. One is Hasidut, one is Mitnagim. And it's 2 different things completely. It's also interesting is that they set up Jewish educational facilities in Russia against the communists, which put their lives at risk to go to jail or killed. And midah keneged midah. If you look now today, the Chabad houses are probably the #1 Jewish educational facilities in the entire world. So it's almost like God rewarded them. You did it in a situation where it was against their, the will of the government, and it was difficult, and they persevered. So God said, when everything will be good, I will make sure, almost, I don't know the reason, but midah keneged midah, that your schools will become a very great amongst the Jewish people.
Did I mishear you? You said Russia?
Which one?
You said somewhere in this area of Russia?
Yeah, that's where Lubavitch from Rusher. But the Alter Rebbe, was actually from Spain. He was Sephardic. He was, Rav Zalman, Rav Shneur Zalman Miliadi was originally actually from Spain. He descended, I guess they left in 1492 when they got evicted from Spain. So his source is actually Sephardi, believe it or not. Okay, Rav Feinstein remained. When asked why, the quiet Rav replied that he was the only practicing rabbi left in town and thus felt the duty to stay. But, like Rav Meltzer, he was unable to sustain his gallant decision. By 1936, the risks could no longer be ignored. In the following year, the Feinstein family set sail for the safety of New York Harbor. Within 5 years, the Jews of Luban were no more. Rav Moshe's father-in-law and mother-in-law remained and were murdered by the Nazis. His brother, Rabbi Mordechai Feinstein, the Rav of Shklov, had been sent to his death in Siberia. And he has a note here on the bottom. In the introduction of Igrot Moshe, Volume 8, he discusses this. In New York, Rav Moshe's mind was still not at ease, and he confided to Rav Wasserman that there were people back home who were still very angry at him, accusing him of deserting them. Rav Wasserman eased his conscience by quoting the Hafetz Chaim: "No one can be expected to spend his whole life in a place where it is forbidden to speak God's name." So Rav Wasserman had a, you have to remember, when the rabbis did leave, they didn't tell everybody. And some people were left behind that got killed. Some people were left behind that had...
They tell everybody.
We're learning about it. I don't have the reasons. Again, we're going into this as a learner and a researcher, and we're trying to understand what happened. And we're looking at Joe Bobker's article, which is really in depth and discusses a lot of the details. And so we're kind of seeing why, we don't know. But we do know what happened, what was written afterwards, and there were many interviews. So we're looking at that part. Now, the wake-up call. This is the title over here. Now, in November 9 to 10, 1938, Hitler's career thugs unleashed a pogrom that would have made medieval crusaders or the czars of Russia proud. It became known as the cataclysmic Night of Broken Glass, or euphemistically, Kristallnacht, Crystal Night. More Jewish-owned glass was shattered during that one night than the entire annual glass production of Belgium. Wow. 30,000 Jewish men between the ages of 16 and 60 were sent to suffer in Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. Many didn't return. Instead, their families received tin cans of ashes with a cynical proviso on the outside, 3.7 marks, postage due on arrival, and a bill for cremation inside. So they took the family members, they killed them, burned them to ashes, put them into a can, and said if they wanted, they have to pay 3.75 marks. Marks was the currency at the time in Germany, meaning that was all that was left. Those who did return, recalls Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach. This Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach is not to be confused with its cousin, Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach, the singing rabbi, two different people. In a biography of his saintly father, Rabbi Yosef Tzvi Carlebach, came back maimed, with terror in their eyes. And yet, after being beaten by marauding mobs, harassed by the Gestapo, and having his beloved Bornplatz synagogue in Hamburg destroyed, Rav Carlebach decided to stay and rebuild, as did many Orthodox German rabbanim and community leaders. He has a note here. In 1939, the Jews of Danzig quickly sold all the antique Judaica and their magnificent 1,600-member Great Synagogue to the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, and used the proceeds to buy passage out of Germany. They were the only Jewish community in Germany to do so. So only one community did it. The 1,600 member, the Great Synagogue of the Jews of Danzig. They sold everything they had to get money. The Jewish Theological Seminary gave them the money in New York, and everybody, the only city, they got all out. They picked up, they said, we're going as a community, we got to get out of this hellhole. And they all left. And in the United States, the concerned family of Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Unsdorfer, a popular, dignified, and learned rabbi in Bratislava, Czechoslovakia, immediately sent him and his family entry permits to America. But the Rav refused to leave, explaining that it would be wrong to desert his synagogue and friends. Let's take a look here. Rav Unsdorfer stayed, but he sent his two older sons, aged 19 and 20, to England. His teenage son, Simcha Bunim, survived Auschwitz and Buchenwald, went to England and became the general secretary of Agudat Israel and editor of the religious weekly, the Jewish Tribune. In his sensitive memoir, Rav Simcha Bunim recalled his father's thought patterns after Kristallnacht, which were similar to those of many German rabbanim at the time. My father was an optimist, an unshakable believer in the triumph of human rights and justice. He believed that we were all in God's hands, and he remained optimistic. By early 1942, the threat of deportation became really serious. Terror and fear descended upon us like a blanket of fog. But Father remained hopeful. The Slovakian government is headed by Tiso, a Catholic priest, he would argue. He could never allow deportation. No religious man would ever be party to it. The Vatican wouldn't permit it. But by April 1942, these hopes were shattered. The mass murder of Slovakian Jewry began at the rate of 3,000 per week. Father was still optimist, but his faith was now tempered by events. Rabbi Simcha Bunim Unsdorfer, the Yellow Star, 1961. The results: Rav Unsdorfer was later murdered with his wife in Auschwitz, and in March 1942, the majestic Rav Carlebach was murdered in a forest near Riga, Latvia, together with his wife Charlotte and 3 daughters, Ruth, Naomi, and Sarah. 36. Rav Yosef Tzvi Karlbach's youngest son Shlomo survived 4 years in 9 different concentration camps and ended up in the United States as the Mashgiach Ruchani of Yeshivat Chaim Berlin in Brooklyn. That's on Coney Island. Rav Karlbach's 4 older sisters and brothers survived the Holocaust because their parents had sent them and another sister to England and Palestine before the war. Wow. Let's continue. 10,000 Jews of Hamburg, Germany, of the Hamburg, Germany community disappeared in the bowels of Auschwitz, Auschwitzim, in southern Poland, and Theresienstadt, Terezin, Czechoslovakia. A year later, in September 1941, the Jews of Panovich, Lithuania, had been herded into the nearby Pajnost forest and murdered en masse. That's the Jews of Panovich. Their Rav, Rabbi Yosef Shlomo Kahaneman, survived because he was in Palestine en route to the United States for a fundraising visit. His wife Fagi and children were killed. Only one son survived the Holocaust. At his funeral, his disciple, Rabbi Shmuel Rozovsky, revealed that Rav Kahaneman's soul found no rest. He was frequently bothered and disturbed by the thought, I saved myself, but not my ship. But this is what gave him strength and tremendous strength to create and build, to work day and night, all for one goal, so that instead of having saved myself but not my ship, he would also save his ship, his generation. He would rebuild the destroyed world of Torah, restoring the crown to its former glory, until it would be as if he had saved the entire ship by extricating it from the stormy ocean waves and bringing it to the safe shores of Zion. Let's take a look at, he has here 2 notes. Another eulogy pointed out the agonizing dialogue between Noach, who saved himself but not his ship, his generation, and Moses, who saved himself and his ship. Because Noach failed to save his generation, the negative connotations of treacherous floodwaters were named him the words of Noach, May Noach, in Devarim Rabbah 11-3, and Bereshit Rabbah 34-4. What is the halacha? Now we're going to go into the halachic matters of what does a person do in this situation. Must the rabbinic captain go down with his sinking community ship? Is that halacha? Does he really need to do such a thing? In his commentary on Masechet Hoyarot, Rabbi Chaim Hirschenson, whose family had moved to Palestine from Pinsk in the late 19th century, and who became the Rav of Hoboken, New Jersey in 1904, discusses the maritime custom of women and children first, and concludes it is a conflict with Jewish law, Chayichak Kodmim, since one life comes before others. So he had a whole discussion whether or not wife and children should come first if somebody needs to save himself. Of course, everyone in the modern world are all very, very quick. But the Torah law says you must save your life first before you save anybody else's life. From all of the above, it seems that there is no answer, just general guidelines. One of the most painful and consequential of all leadership decisions during the Third Reich's Endlosung der Judenfrage was left up to each individual. It wasn't done on a mass scale. It was just guidelines and everyone had to do what they had to do. In the midst of the inferno, the same question was posed to the Dayan of Brisk, but he could not give an answer. He compared the Hitlerite times to the pre-creation chaos that he reminded everyone after thousands of years was still beyond the comprehension of the greatest rabbis. And what was the position of Rav Grodzinski? Rav Grodzinski had personally been in the same tight spot as the Chatam Sofer. He had fled Vilna during World War I, and they described how personally wounded he felt when he returned home and was accused of abandoning his community. 20 years later, with the outbreak of Nazi hostilities in Poland, the 77-year-old Torah leader stayed in Vilna. He was too sick to travel, but he urged all the Rashi Yeshivot, teachers and students, to get out of Poland as quickly as possible. And that's brought down the day Vilna died by Yosef Friedlander in Tradition 37-2, summer 2003. So even though the rabbi was old, he told everybody that he had seen this already before. Get out now, don't wait. but he was much more ambivalent towards Poland's community rabbanim, and even to those who had already fled to Vilna. Rav Grudzinski cautiously suggested that perhaps they should return and stay with their communities, yet he did not pressure anybody, and reiterated the position of the Hatam Sofer that there exists no absolute psak, that each Rav had to assess his own circumstances, sense of duty, and risk. And this is exactly what they did. 170 rabbis and Roshei Yeshivot and 2,300 fleeing expatriates from the top 23 Polish yeshivot arrived in Vilna, including such influential figures as Rabbi Yitzchak Ze'ev Velvel Soloveitchik from Brisk, Rabbi Aryeh Shapiro and Rabbi Abraham Yafin from Bialystok, Rabbi Moshe Shatzkis from Lomza, Rabbi Aharon Kotler of Kletz, Rabbi Eliezer Yehuda Finkel from Mir, and Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman of Baranowisk, Rabbi Mendel Zaks from Radin, and Rabbi Shabtai Yogel of Slanim. Most had left their wives, children, and other family members behind because they thought their absence was only for a short time, and because of the severe weather conditions and malnutrition which made traveling a serious risk. The winter of 1939-40 was one of the coldest Europe had experienced in the 20th century. Once they were ensconced in Vilna, the fateful debate began as they reviewed their options with their Lithuanian counterparts, including the yeshiva heads of Panovich, Slobodka, and Telzh. And this is brought down. He brings here a few different books of Yeshivat Etz Chaim de Klesk, Mostot, and a few others as well. With the exception of the Agudat Yisrael Convention, this was the largest concentration of the greatest Torah minds in all of Europe, all facing the same question, what to do next. And they could not agree on a course of action. Consider Rav Grudzinski. Let's take a look what he says here. And he brings down the book of Aharon Suraski, Achiezer Kovitz, Igrot Shel Rabbi Chaim Ozer Grudzinski, 1970. Consider Rav Grudzinski, supported by his local Va'ad HaYeshivot and its top rabbis, including Rabbi Nisan Yofi, who was later murdered at Ponar, Rabbi Aharon Berek, who was killed in the Vilna ghetto, Rabbi Chizkiyahu Yosef Mishkovsky, who survived the Holocaust, and the influential Rabbi Joseph Shub, wanted them to stay put, Shev ve'al ta'aseh, in Vilna, argued that in times of uncertainty, one takes no risk. They still remembered World War I, when such yeshivot as Etz Chaim, Radin Mir, and Navar Rudak fled to Russia, only to return to Poland when hostilities ceased. At a meeting of Roshei Yeshivot to discuss several plans of emigration, Rav Grudzinski urged the sages not to panic, that every place is dangerous, and that Lithuania might remain calm, being neither black nor red, but pink. So let's take a look here at the notes. He says the committee for the yeshivot was formed in 1924 in Grodno to serve as a network of 70 Polish yeshivot. So I guess it was a collaboration of the yeshivot. It ceased all activities in 1940. Rav Grudzinski also wanted them to stay for another reason, since he fully expected the yeshiva students to help rebuild Torah life in Poland after Hitler's imminent defeat. He did not want them dispersed too far away. Rav Grudzinski was also concerned that the yeshuv in Palestine could not support so many yeshivot all at once, and thus many students would drop out of Talmud Torah and look for jobs instead. This fantasy was shattered one bright summer day in June 1940. The safe haven of Vilna and other cities in Lithuania suddenly turned into claustrophobic Soviet bear trap. He takes a look here, and he brings down the book, Jerusalem of Lithuania in Battle and Destruction, 1948. The fact is that within their stressful, complicated, and unprecedented situation, nobody in Vilna knew what to do. Some rabbis were saved because they listened to their students. Some students died because they listened to their rabbis. Some rabbis died because they took the advice of other rabbis. Others lived for the same reason. No one had a roadmap to safety. Each decision came into being flawed by the very inexplicably and unpredictability of the dangerous times. Rabbi Shimon Kalish, the Amshin of a Rebbe, supported by Rabbi Abraham Dov Ber Kahani Shapiro, the highly influential Rav of Konos, disagreed with Rav Grudzinski. They urged their colleagues and students to get out as fast as possible via the closest exit valve, but the rabbis of Kamenetz thought it best to return to Poland right away and wait out the hostilities. Meanwhile, the student body of Mir wanted to go east to the United States. The Briskerov wanted to go to Palestine, while the yeshiva heads of Telz decided to stay, because that's what the previous Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Y. Bloch, had done during World War I. The Telz students were later rounded up and brutally murdered, as was Rabbi Abraham Yitzchak Bloch, their Rosh Yeshiva, together with his family. The Rosh Yeshiva's brother, Rabbi Eliyahu Meir Bloch, and brother-in-law, Rabbi Chaim Mordechai Mordele Katz, survived the Holocaust because they had left Telz in the autumn of 1940 for the United States on a fundraising trip. They arrived in the winter of 1941 together with 10 Telz students who had trekked through Siberia, Japan, and Australia and were unable to return. By then, the Nazis had occupied Lithuania. The two Rabbanim knew nothing about the fate of their families. Later, Rav Bloch was told that his wife and 4 children had been murdered. Rav Katz was told of murder of his wife and 10 children. Rabbi Abraham Shoshana, the yeshiva in its development, chapters of history and evaluation in Sefer Yovel, HaMe'i'ah Shel Yeshivot, Telz, 1975. Let's take a look here. At the end of June, let's take a look here, when Rav Shach asked Rav Grzinski what to do, he received a cryptic response that Russia should not be left void of Torah scholars, hinting that Rav Shach should return to Kletz. Instead, Rav Shach decided to go to Palestine. So Rav Shach was told to do one thing by Rav Grzinski, and he ended up doing something else. Rav Cutler wanted to go to Palestine and was adamantly against Orthodox Jews going to the United States. He warned those going east that they should end up in Siberia. Ironically, Rav Cutler ended up surviving the Holocaust by going to America. So it's interesting. He wanted to go to Palestine, and he was against any Orthodox Jews going to America.
And then he went to America?
And he went to America and he survived. And whoever did
Why?
it. This is just what happened. I can't give you the why.
I know.
I can't give you the why.
Just talking out loud.
I know. I'm saying, Ezra, believe me, we're all learning this and we're all intrigued because this seemingly is unbelievable. He's giving you everything. He showed you that some rabbis who didn't listen to their rabbi, but listened to their students who were like, listen, rabbi, this is something here crazy going on. We got to get out of here. Those rabbis survived. The ones who listened to their rabbis didn't survive. It's crazy what he's showing you here because there seemingly was no answer. And many of the right answers were wrong. Many of the wrong answers that you thought were wrong were right. And some people didn't want to do something, they did it. It's unbelievable. At the end of June 1941, the Rosh Yeshiva of Slobodka and their students in the Kovno ghetto were murdered, as was the brilliant Rabbi Yonah Karpelov, who had his internal organs ripped out and wrapped around his talus. The yeshiva's Gabbai, Reb Gershon, had his throat slit. Wow. The Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Abraham Grzinski, continued giving Musar Shiurim in the ghetto until he was taken to a hospital in July 1944 after a serious beating. He died the following day when the Nazis burned the ghetto hospital to the ground. In mid-1941, Rabbi Daniel Mavshowitz, the Rosh Yeshiva of the famous Kelm Beit Talmud in Lithuania and brother-in-law of Rabbi Eliyahu E. Dessler, was murdered together with all the Rabbanim, teachers, students, and their families in the Groz Hebisky fields. Nechama Leba was the oldest daughter of the altar of Kelm, Saba of Kelm. She couldn't walk, so the daughter of Rabbi Simcha Zissel Ziv, the yeshivas found her, carry her in a chair to her grave. She was then thrown into a gravel pit to die. Wow, there's a couple notes here. Let's take a look. Rav Lazer survived the Holocaust by moving with his father to London for health reasons. He would later become the influential Rosh Kollel of Gateshead, London, and the Mashkiach of Panovich Yeshiva in Bnei Brak, Israel. He has another note here on the bottom. Let's take a look. He brings the source. These will I remember, biographies of leaders of religious Jewry in Europe who perished during the years 1939 to 45, Volume 1, Yiddish original. Wow, that's sad. As late as mid-1944, Hungarian Torah sages felt so secure that they were already planning for a post-war regeneration of Jewish life in Hungary. But Adolf Eichmann had other plans. At breathtaking speed, the top tier of Hungarian Rabbanim and their families were methodically shoved onto trains and gassed immediately upon their arrival at the Auschwitz-Birkenau grounds. He has here the next title, Ich bin nicht besser von sie. I am not better than they. The idea that major rabbinical figures, Ger, Belz, Satmar, Lubavitch, escaped Hitler's tightening vise, while thousands of their loyal followers were misled into meeting horrible fiery death, is an indictment grounded more in anguish and anger than in facts. The obligation of a trapped Torah leadership during unprecedented times of terror and trauma is a complex issue, and the moral nuances are extraordinarily multifaceted and cannot be generalized. Even when rabbis fled from one place to another, there were no guarantee of safety. The executioner usually followed them. Consider when the Germans arrived in Zdunska Wola on September 6, 1939, the town's two rabbis, Rabbi Moshe Ber and Rabbi M. Gelbard, escaped. Both were later killed. Rav Ber in the Warsaw Ghetto, Rav Gelbard in the Ukraine in the same year, 1942, as their community was liquidated. Scores of Torah scholars flatly rejected opportunities to escape, refusing to leave their families and communities. One need only flip through the dozens of Yizkor Sefarim memorial books and shudder at the extensive number of rabbis, rebbes, and Rosh Yeshivot listed among the dead. Ger Rabbi Avraham Mordechai Alter's instincts were correct. When on a previous visit to Palestine, he decided to stay. But the Rebbe returned to Poland after being pressured by his Hasidim and ended up escaping back to Palestine in 1940. The vast majority of his 200,000 followers were murdered. Although there are no accurate statistics, the low number of rabbinic survivors suggest that the vast majority agreed with the thought process of Rabbi Yitzchak Menachem Mendel Danziger, the fourth Admor of Alexander, Lodz, and leader of the second largest Hasidic group in Poland. Rav Danziger was stuck in the Warsaw Ghetto and had a chance to flee to Palestine. He approached this sensitive issue by focusing on two parallel statements in the Torah and Talmud, for they had holy work to do. They carried on their shoulder the ark that carries its bearers, and concluded that Torah leaders must stay and shoulder the burdens of their communities, which he defined as holy work, declaring, I will not save my life when all the Jews are in danger. In 1943, Rav Danziger was murdered with his family in Treblinka. In Rezekne, Latvia, the Jews asked Rabbi Lubavitch and Rabbi Yafin what to do. The two rabbis said they were staying with their community, but each Jew should follow his own conscience whether to stay or flee. Both rabbis were murdered together with the Jews who remained. In September 1939, Rabbi Shimon Kalish, the Amshiner Rebbe, urged the Jewish community of Otwock, a health spa town south of Warsaw, Poland, to leave before the Germans arrived. After they refused, he no longer felt bound to stay, and together with his wife and son, managed to escape at the last moment, as did the Admorim of Lubavitch, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, and Modzich, Rabbi Shaul Yedidya Elazar Taub, who were also in Otwock. By September 1942, the 12,000 Jews of Otwock had disappeared in Treblinka. When the war broke out, the noble Rabbi Abraham Dov Ber Kahane Shapiro, president of the Rabbis of Lithuania, was in Switzerland for health reasons. His son, Yerucham Yehuda Leib, a prominent attorney in America, immediately understood the risks involved if his father returned to Kovno and urged him to go straight to Palestine. Instead, Rav Kahane Shapiro, although a committed Zionist, returned to his hometown explaining the ship's captain is the last to abandon the burning ship, not the first. In this time of danger, this time of trouble for Israel, my place is with my community. He then sat down and began writing halachic guidelines for the soon-to-be thousands of agunot. And in February 1943, the ailing chief rabbi of the Kovno ghetto was murdered. His family was executed the following year in the infamous 9th Fort outside Kovno. When he first heard that Jews were being gassed in mobile vans and buried in mass graves in Chelmno, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Lau, chief rabbi of Piotrkow Tribunalski, Poland, the 37th descendant of a rabbinical dynasty with a doctorate in philosophy from the University of Vienna, urged everybody to flee the ghetto immediately, but he decided to say, explaining, a shepherd does not abandon his flock in the face of a pack of wolves. I will not seek to save my own skin and abandon my flock. Rav Lau and his flock of 24,000 Jews met their deaths in the gas chambers of Treblinka in October 1942. Several of his sons died with him. Rebbetzin Lau was murdered in November 1944. Their youngest son, Yisrael Meir, was liberated from Buchenwald in April 1945 by American forces. While studying at the Kol Torah Yeshiva in Jerusalem, Yisrael Meir was encouraged by the Ger Rebbe and Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach to enter rabbinics. He later became the poised and articulate Ashkenazic chief rabbi of Israel and the chairman of the Yad Vashem Council, Jerusalem. In spring of 1939, 5 months before World War II began, Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman was on a fundraising trip to America. The administration of Yeshivat Torah Vodah, Brooklyn, urged him to stay. Rabbi Shlomo Hyman, the Rosh Yeshiva, had agreed to step aside for him, and while Rabbi Gedalia Shor was busy procuring the necessary visas to get Rav Wasserman's students out of Europe. But Rav Wasserman insisted on going back, explaining, would you have me abandon my family and my additional 400 children students? During a stopover in London, Rav Wasserman again rejected pleas from local supporters to stay away from Poland. A captain does not abandon his ship in a storm. My place is at the yeshiva. In 1941, the 67-year-old rabbinic captain was murdered by Lithuanian collaborators. 2 years later, amidst rampant starvation, deadly disease, and daily mass deportations to death camps, the Archbishop of Warsaw offered Rabbi Menachem Zimba, Rabbi Samson Stockhammer, and Rabbi David Shapiro, the 3 leading rabbis in the Warsaw ghetto, refuge in his palace. The rabbis discussed the dilemma they suddenly confronted. When asked, Rabbi Shapiro, what would this do to the morale of Jews in the ghetto? I am the youngest among you, and therefore my words are not binding on you. We already know that we cannot help our people, but by staying with them and by not abandoning them, we encourage them and strengthen their hopes. And this is the only encouragement we are able to give the last Jews. I simply do not have the strength to abandon these wretched people. Will we hide from the Almighty? The same God who is found there is found here. Rav Shapiro's 2 colleagues agreed. Rav Ziemba declared that there be no more discussion on this issue. Shortly thereafter, Rav Zimba was machine gunned to death. Rav Stockhammer died in a bomb attack just 3 days before liberation. Rav Shapiro survived and entered Jewish history as the last Warsaw rabbi of World War II. In 1942, the chief rabbi of Palestine, Rabbi Yitzhak Herzog, was in the United States when he heard that General Erwin Rommel's Afrika Corps were fast advancing toward the Holy Land through North Africa. He immediately went back to lead the Yishuv. He says here, Rav Y. Pinner was a major leader in Lodz, Poland, rejected a similar proposal from the bishop of Lodz, who offered them refuge. Rabbi Riccardo Pacifici, the chief rabbi of Genoa, Italy, refused an opportunity to flee the city and was later gassed to death in Auschwitz in December 1943. Similarly, Rabbi Simcha Bunim Levin, the grandson of Rabbi Henoch, the Alexander Rebbe, and close friend of Rabbi Abraham Mordechai Alter of Ger, the Imre Emet, was offered his freedom from the Warsaw ghetto. He refused unless the Imre Emet's granddaughter and her child would be released with him. His offer was rejected. He was murdered in Treblinka. The young Rabbi Shmuel Shlomo Leiner, a scion of the Radziner Hasidic dynasty, was offered a safe passage to Warsaw, but displaying extraordinary courage, he stayed behind in Wolodawa to help his fellow Jews. Recognizing that his presence lifted the morale of their prey, the Gestapo demanded that Rav Leiner surrender or the ghetto's inhabitants would be slaughtered. Rav Leiner calmly said goodbye to his wife and walked out to the enemy. He was then brutally beaten and sent to be gassed at Sobibor in May 1942. Rabbi Moshe Moshenyu Friedman, the Boyaner Rebbe of Krakow and president of the imposing Chachmei, the wise men of Lublin Yeshiva, refused a South American passport and stayed behind the Tarnow ghetto in southern Poland. By September 1943, the entire ghetto was officially declared Judenrein. The 62-year-old Bayan Rebbe died with his people. Rabbi Charles W. Steckel, Chief Rabbi Osijek, Slovenia, received a 2-word cable from Dr. Simon Ungar, the town's retired chief rabbi, that simply said, Brach lecha, flee at once. Rav Steckel, who survived the Holocaust, immediately urged Croatian Jews to flee to Italy or Hungary. In December 1940, he was offered an escape route but refused twice. It was my moral duty to be with my congregation, he explained humbly. At the end of 1939, Rabbi Shimon Rozovsky, the Rav of Aishishok, Lithuania, had his family from Palestine visiting him. His son Uri and daughter-in-law Fania begged him to return with them. He refused, explaining, a shepherd must remain with his flock. They need me more than ever. Dozens of Hasidic rabbis responded as if in unison. 1 month before Hitler showed up, the English and Italian supporters of Rabbi Shlomo Hanoch Rabinowitz, the Radomsker Rebbe and brilliant creator of the Keter Torah Yeshiva network throughout Poland, begged him to leave and sent him a ticket to fly to Italy from Lodz. The Rebbe refused to board the plane, explaining, "How could I leave the Jews?" The 6-year-old Rebbe was murdered with his family 3 years later in 1942 in the Warsaw Ghetto. The Brezhnev Rebbe, Rabbi Nachum Yehoshua Pechenik, refused an offer to escape from Dombowitz. The Hasidim of the Grodzisker Rebbe, Rabbi Yisrael Shapiro, arranged false papers for him to leave the Warsaw Ghetto, but he refused. Rabbi Yitzchak Yeshayahu Halberstam, the Czechoslovak Rebbe, did the same. Rabbi Yecheskel Halstock, the Austro-Wieser Rebbe, refused an offer from a priest to be taken out of the Sandomierz ghetto. He insisted he would not abandon his community to save himself. Rabbi Halstock was later murdered by the Gestapo. The Admorim of Zabner, Lisk, Zvolin, Karlin, Terzisk, and Grozisk Mazowitzki all had opportunities to leave, but refused. When the following were given a chance to flee, here's what they said. The Trisker Rebbe, I want to be part of the fate of Polish Jewry. Rabbi Baruch Safran, the Komarno Rebbe from Eastern Galicia, all the Jews are in trouble. Heaven forbid that any individual would say, I will save my own life. I am with them in their suffering. So long as one Jew remains in the ghetto, I will stay with him. Rabbi Eliyahu Lifshitz, Ich bin nicht besser von sie. I'm not better than they. The Rav of Grodzisk in Yiddish Griza, Poland, I am not permitted to leave my flock in time of distress. Rabbi Chaimelo, the last Rebbe of Shidlovsk, Shidlovce, insisted on staying with his community as they were marched to death in Treblinka. I went at the head of my congregation in life. I will also go with them on the last journey. When Rabbi Yeshaya Englard of Sosnowitz was tipped off by the Zaglebi Judenrat to escape a pending action, he refused. I will not leave them, his fellow Jews in the Zaglebi ghetto. I will only be freed with everybody. Rabbi Yehuda Leib Eisenberg of Lask and Rabbi Yecheskel, the Rav of Ostrowitz, refused offers of freedom. So did Rabbi David Feigenbaum, descendant of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who stayed behind in Pruzana, Lithuania. In January 1943, he became its last rabbi when he, his wife, and 2 sons met their maker at Auschwitz. Rabbi Yitzchak Nissenbaum, the influential promoter of Kiddush HaChaim as the proper course of Kiddush Hashem, flatly rejected safe passage out of Poland to stay with his people. He was murdered in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942, refusing offers to leave, were Rabbi Eliezer Halperin of Koretz, Rabbi Kalmish Finkler of Radositsky, and Rabbi Abraham David of Damitz. When the Germans arrived in Lubin, Poland, the family of Rabbi Moshe Mordechai Twersky, brother-in-law of the Novominsker Rebbe, made frantic efforts to get him out of Europe. In London, his son, Rabbi Abraham Yitzhak, arranged $3,000 in order to bribe a German Gestapo general Rabbi Menachem Tzvi Eichenstein, his son-in-law in St. Louis, arranged a visa to the United States, but Rav Trotsky wrote back to his son in London, "What is the captain's duty when his ship capsizes? Should he desert the boat? I live in the midst of my people and I cannot desert them." The 66-year-old Rav Twersky was murdered in 1942 together with his wife and daughter in the Kemnita forest outside of Lubin. Galician Rabbi Mordechai Rothenberg, chief rabbi of Antwerp, Belgium, and a member of the Moetzet Gedulat Torah, was sent to the Vidal camp the internment in France. His charismatic daughter Richa and industrial son-in-law Yitzhak Sternbach, renowned for their rescue activism, arranged for her father to flee to Switzerland. He refused to leave the other Jewish prisoners behind, and together with his wife Devorah, was murdered in Auschwitz in 1944. Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, dean of the Hildesheimer Rabbinical Seminary in Berlin, which never reopened after Kristallnacht, voluntarily joined the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto despite being a Lithuanian national and therefore permitted to leave Poland. When hostilities began on September 1st, 1939, Hungarian Rabbi Michael Dov Weissmandel and was studying old Hebrew manuscripts at the Bodleian Library at Oxford University, London. Yet he immediately volunteered to return to Slovakia as an agent of the World Agudat Israel, and then he plunged into rescue activities. Rav Weissmandel survived the Holocaust, but his wife and small children were murdered in Auschwitz in 1944. We'll end this today, but what we see from here thus far is that a lot of these Gedolim were given opportunities to leave, and they seemingly chose to stay behind. And the ones that did leave survived. The Amshinover Rebbe warned everybody to get out. Whoever didn't believe him, he picked up with him and his family, he left. Whoever didn't believe him stayed behind and ended up dying. This is an unbelievable article. We're on page 27. There's 11 pages left, 38. So God willing, we'll continue tomorrow. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen. Amen.